It wasn't pretty, but BYU is out of the Big 12 tournament. And is that necessarily a bad thing? We're talking about it on POSTCAST.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Special edition postcast here as BYU falls out of the Big 12 tournament by virtue of a 74-54 blowout loss to the Houston Cougars. Now, that scoreline alone will make you think, okay, what in the heck happened to BYU? But any of you who watched that game watched a BYU squad that I thought actually had opportunities in the first half, despite not scoring for the first 6 minutes and 45 seconds, if I recall correctly. There were looks generated by BYU in this game, simply just wouldn't fall. The other thing I want to talk about on this postcast edition of the show is how good Houston is. That Houston team very well could win a national title. They have all the pieces. They play just an absolutely frenetic pace, but super physical style of basketball that is going to make life very difficult for BYU or any opponent to deal with. But getting back to the point at hand, tough loss for BYU, no doubt about that. Obviously, when you lose by 20 points, you crash out of the Big 12 tournament, you're thinking, okay, is there a concern level that I should have maybe higher than I had about this BYU Cougars squad? I wouldn't necessarily say that the alarm bell should be going off quite yet. I saw Jordan Kennard, one of our longtime listeners on social media. He essentially posted, and I'm summing this up, Jordan, so apologies for summarizing it, but essentially saying these are the losses that give him, speaking of Jordan, pause about BYU's chances of making a deep run in the NCAA tournament. While I understand that, I will point directly to how Houston plays and how difficult it is to deal with that. There are very few, if any, teams that can play that style of basketball every minute of every game and hold up. And Houston, last year, they played that super physical brand of basketball and got worn out in the Big 12 tournament, ultimately paid the price in the NCAA tournament. We'll see if they can overcome that this year. But the bigger point to be made is, now as BYU turns their attention to Selection Sunday and where they're going to be seated in the NCAA tournament, I don't think you're going to see an opponent the caliber of a Houston, at least in the first two rounds for BYU. Now, if you're a 6 seed, you can face a 3 seed potentially that could be that caliber. The seeding will obviously dictate that, but I still look at this BYU squad and I'm still emboldened to think that this team has pieces and has the potential to put together one of those legendary March Madness runs, but it will take them playing much more consistent basketball than they did. BYU in this game against Houston made 6 of 28 three-pointers. Now, the day before that, they made 18 of 36 from beyond the arc to scrape past Iowa State. Did BYU use up all their magic in that game against Iowa State? Maybe so, but the law of numbers, as my friends DJ and PK like to say on our show, it comes actually from it comes from Matt Harpring, a former Utah Jazz man, Georgia Tech product. He talked once upon a time the law of numbers, which is the law of averages, but he screwed up the phrasing. We like to mess around with it and call it the law of numbers. They will bring you back down to earth. BYU shot 50% from three against Iowa State. And like I said, they needed every one of those 18 three-pointers. In this game against Houston, BYU shot 6 of 28. If you combine the two totals of those two games, a total of 64 three-point attempts against 24 makes, what does that percentage come out to? It comes out to a tidy 37.5%. How does that match up with BYU's season-long average? Well, good question that you asked out there if you're watching this and or listening to it. By the way, weigh in with your comments. We'll get to those momentarily. But 37.5% shooting across the two games here in the Big 12 tournament, how does that match up against BYU season average? BYU season average from three, 37.8%. So we're talking decimal points off of their average. Yes, BYU could have used 4, 5, 3 more pointers against Houston, made this game much tighter. And they did generate, I thought, pretty decent looks, all things considered, in that first half. But they could not get them to fall. I think that goes a credit to Houston's swarming defense. They didn't have Juwan Roberts, and it didn't seem to matter for how Houston played this game. They were ferocious defensively. That's a really, really tough team, I think, for anybody. I don't care who Houston will face in the NCAA tournament. Good luck to them. That is a team that I want no part of if I'm anybody out there, including BYU. Bigger point, though, is that BYU can take some satisfaction knowing that they played, I thought, decent basketball. Second half, they come out. A guy like Keba Keita, I thought, provided a spark for BYU. And Keba, I've got to give him a shout for his stat line in this game. He ends up having 14 points, 12 rebounds, 5 of them on the offensive glass, and 2 blocks. One of them is Patton did just go up and just absolutely wallop the ball out of the air. He has proven to be an enforcer, a difference maker for BYU on the interior. The problem was, you don't have the outside shooting to complement that. And it felt like there were pushes at points in the second half, but BYU could never really get the traction they needed to really make Houston sweat at all. And that's difficult to stomach, obviously. But also, let's consider that this Houston game, I don't think it'll have much impact, if any, on BYU seating in the NCAA tournament. The selection committee is already meeting in Indianapolis. They've been meeting, I think, for 2 days now already. And I would imagine they've already got BYU penciled in at, I would imagine, is it currently a 6 seed? I thought maybe a 5 seed would be in play. That's where I think the rub is. Depending on Thursday, Saturday, the format, I could see a 5 or a 6 seed being in play. But I also think this BYU team, they don't care where they're seated. They just want to get out there and get this taste out of their mouths, because that's a disappointing loss. And I thought Kevin Young, if you listen to him with Gregor Bell and Mark Durant after the game, he summed it up best. When you lay an egg, that's the term he used. When you lay an egg in the first half, it's hard to dig out of a hole the size that we created. I'm summarizing what he said there, and he's not wrong. 20 first half points. You're down by 21 points at halftime. Good luck to anybody against what Houston can do to you in coming back against that. So all things considered, BYU learned, I think, a good, hard lesson in this game. The other side of it is that, in all reality, it doesn't particularly matter. I know that sounds kind of trite to say that after BYU got their butts kicked. I get that. But think about the impact of this game. I don't think it had that large of an impact on seeding, on BYU's overall fate in the postseason. They just learned that, hey, that's an elite team. We want to be that style of team. What's it going to take for us to take the next step or steps to get to where Houston is at? And maybe it is adding AJ DeBonsa down the line, and next year BYU could be that caliber of program. That's a discussion for another day. But now as BYU awaits their seeding on Sunday, they have got to be thinking, all right, we learned what we are going to face here in the NCAA tournament, but also I don't think that you can expect that the officiating in the NCAA tournament will be as what I'm trying to say, not as egregious as it's been at points here in the Big 12 Conference. Guys like TJ Otzelberger, who coaches Iowa State, and Kelvin Sampson, they coach a very, very physical brand of basketball. I'm going to pull this up right now because I want to give a shout out to Mala. He put this on. I put out a short shortly after this game went final, and he had a great comment. I want to pull this up here, and I'm actually going to agree with Mala 514 on this, and it's a long comment, but let me get to it momentarily. Love how the announcers brought up Yegor's lack of physicality 4 to 5 times. You know who would have played great in this game? Marcus Sasser, Jerice Walker, Udoka Azubuike, Ochai Agbaji, Jared Butler, Davion Mitchell, Keontae George, except all those dudes have been NBA busts. Unchecked physicality doesn't equal toughness. There are reasons why other leagues produce better NBA talent than the Big 12. And maybe the reason that coaches like Sampson and TJ Otzelberger focus on getting upperclassmen and insisting on fouling every play because, quote, they can't call them all, unquote. The way that TJ Otzelberger was begging his players for offensive and defensive collisions yesterday was pathetic. Maybe the Big 12 needs to have a paradigm shift on how they officiate and how they want to be viewed as a league. By the way, Yegor has put on 16 pounds of muscle since coming to BYU, and whether he leaves and gets drafted or stays another year, he is more likely to have much more success, have a much more successful career than anybody mentioned above. I think I agree with what Mala says there. It's an ultra physical brand of basketball the Big 12 features, especially from Iowa State and Houston. You're not going to see that very often in the NCAA tournament. Now, could teams watch what Houston did to BYU and try and replicate that? Yes, they could try to replicate it, but the conditioning and the physicality necessary to hold that up over 40 minutes, good luck getting your team ready in short order for that. That's the only concern I have with trying to expect that coming out of the NCAA tournament. And that gives me hope for BYU when it comes to the NCAA tournament, because I expect the officiating to be different. And I just don't expect the opponent or opponents BYU faces in the round of 64, the round of 32. I just don't think they can bring that same level of physicality to BYU. If I'm wrong about that, I will acknowledge it and we'll talk about that. But the other side of this is that BYU, they're going to put guys in the pros. And a guy like Jaeger Demon, he will do much better in the NBA because the officiating in the NBA will not allow him to get his manhandled as he's been in the NCAA, in the Big 12 play. Jock looks tired. I am a little bit tired. I had to go meet with my tax guy right after this game went final. Talk about a thrilling Friday night to go and find out what you owe the government. That's always fun. But the bigger point is comments here is that Sweet 16 possible. I'm hoping that comes from B. Smith. It is possible. I still think BYU has it in them to make a run to the Sweet 16. That'd be the first time since the Jimmer Fredette era that they've made a run to the Sweet 16. They actually haven't advanced in the NCAA tournament at all since then, if you don't count a first four win and that comeback against Iona. But other comments here, throw this up from SWB. I've been proud of the Cougs, but today's showing was disappointing. They needed a good showing, even if a loss, not a shellacking. I agree with that to a point, but the way that Houston plays, they shellac everybody, don't they? They just absolutely bring it. Mark Sanders, will this loss affect our seeding? I don't think so. Like I said, I think the NCAA Tournament Selection Committee's already got BYU kind of pegged where they're at. And I think it's on the outside of the 5 seed, probably a likely 6 seed. That's kind of where I've been sitting on all this throughout this. And I get Mark also said the announcers are really down on Jaeger. I just don't get why they were down on him because, like I said, he is a young player, but he's getting absolutely manhandled. And a lot of those calls won't exist in the NBA. I know that's a conversation about the difference in officiating with college basketball versus the NBA. That's not what we're talking about here. But Ray Conger, no shame losing to Houston. Yeah, nobody's really beaten Houston. Were they 19-1 in the Big 12 this season? They just absolutely dominated. Chase Stewart here. Can't wait for the committee to use that loss as the reason they seed them lower than they deserve. I just don't see them getting seated lower than they deserve. I think BYU's proven with all the Q1 wins that piled up over the past 3 weeks, I think that they are going to be just fine. Could I be wrong about that? Sure. And I've been surprised before. The NCAA Selection Committee, it can get you upset because they can downgrade you in that. Other questions. Mark Sanders, potential. Yeah, there's potential there in this BYU squad. Let's see. Swing Savvy, our good friend Ryan. Keba Keita is a dog. We need more dogs. Keba brought the power in that second half. He needed other guys to go with him to help lift BYU in that game. And the sad part is they could never really get that going to any big level. Trevin Nell said in the post-game press conference that Dallin Hall essentially told him how it was at halftime. I think it was Jay Drew that said that Trevin was getting a talking to by Dallin on the court going into the second half. That's senior leadership trying to go out and bark at guys. And I appreciate what Dallin did because there were some guys who needed some talking to, and I think Trevin was one of them. He needed a fire lit under his you-know-what, and it didn't really amount to much. But other questions here. Jason, I didn't hear Mawitt's name as much as I normally do. Best defender in the conference, but went more silent than I expected against Houston. I just think that's just more about just what Houston's all about than anything else, is that Houston is absolutely, legitimately, they're elite. They make life difficult for everybody. I know that it's difficult to stomach that, watching BYU get pummeled twice by them, but join the club. Everybody else seemingly got pummeled by them this year. So the other thing about this is you look at it and say, what's next for BYU? Well, you wait Selection Sunday, and then we look at what the matchups look like when it comes to the tournament brackets. And crazy thing happened in March. We all know that, but not too complicated. What's the ceiling for BYU? I've always thought that Sweet 16 for me would be the ceiling that I would accept for BYU. I didn't necessarily buy into the dark horse Final Four stuff. If they had maybe beaten Houston, maybe I would have bought more fully into that. But I think Sweet 16 is still on the table for this squad. Once again, it goes against how the seeding will plan out. And obviously your opponent, who your next opponent in the second round is, let's say you're in a 6-11 matchup and you're facing the 3-14. If that 14 can get an upset over the 3, that opens the door for you there. Chase Stewart, the roof is the ceiling. Yes, I've used that phrase multiple times here. That's the Michael Jordan phrase from back in the day at North Carolina. But I think that the ceiling right now is the Sweet 16. But we'll see. I think simply advancing the NCAA tournament would be an accomplishment because it's been since 2011 that BYU's actually gotten to the round of 32. So I think that you look, B. Smith, what is the bare minimum for BYU in the tournament to be a successful season? It's advancing. You got to get to the round of 32. If you go one and done again, that's a disappointment. You can't lose in the first round. That would, I think, absolutely point to this is a disappointing season for BYU. So There you go. Those are my thoughts here on a postcast. Thank you for bearing with me. I had to get some things situated. Like I said, I had to meet with the tax guy, and that's always a fun thing to do on a Friday night. But nonetheless, wanted to make sure we got a postcast and talk about BYU. We will have a show coming up shortly after the selection show wraps up. We'll talk about where BYU seated. We'll get you an early look at the bracket. What are the chances BYU can make that run in the NCAA tournament? We'll just make sure that we break it all down for you guys and get an early look at that, and obviously spend next week, all throughout the week, preparing you for that first round matchup, and fingers crossed they advance and make a run here in March. But as always, thank you for your guys' support of the podcast. You guys are absolutely the best. Thank you for staying up late with me and chatting. It's always good to get your guys' interaction. But as always, thank you for being everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.